how is whenever God would command in the Old Testament to his people, to the Israelites, whenever he would uh, command the total annihilation of a certain tribe, when he would when they would be quote unquote devoted to destruction to Yahweh, um, how is this related to the giants and the giant clans?
It's a good question. Yeah, and I think that's caused a lot of stumbling for people who sort of read it on the face of it, had a bit of a moral dilemma, and a lot of people have walked away from the faith because they perhaps,
I know of a person like that. I
yeah,
know,
just
unfortunately. So this is more of an apologetic subtopic that I would
mm,
like you to talk about. You can take as much time as you have, but please give us the context of this. Was God really so mean that He would order even innocent children and animals to be killed for no reason because God was so insecure in Himself? But what is the actual context of this? Whenever God would issue this command and the giant clans, how are they related?
okay, so good questions. Firstly, when we read Joshua, for example, that's a military text, and it, in the ancient world, you had a particular literary type, like it's a kind of genre where these battles are described in particular terms, and they're not afraid to use a bit of exaggeration. They're not afraid to kind of round up the numbers and make themselves look good. That's part of normal literary convention in the ancient Near East when it comes to military narratives, right? So the first thing we've got to understand is when they say, oh, we slaughtered every man, woman, and child, that isn't necessarily what they meant on a strictly literal scientific level. Okay, but it's designed to convey this idea that it was a total victory, right? Like they totally won, uh, left no survivors, took no prisoners, showed no mercy. It was, our God's the best because this happened and we completely won and there's no question, right? So that's a part of what goes on in the language of the text, which we need to be aware of. But particularly when we get to that idea of being devoted to destruction or accursed, or however they want to say it, there's a bit of ambiguity there because the Hebrew term behind this actually comes in a couple of forms and can be a bit confusing. So you have the cherem, which is the uh, removal of objects from human use. Okay, so cherem applies when items are taken, say in this context, the spoils of war devoted to God. Right, once you devote something to God, in terms of some physical item, whether it be silver and gold, or particular metals, things, the iron things they wanted to devote to God, they're basically removed from human use. Okay, so people aren't allowed to touch those things, have those things. The priests were given custody over those things, and they were to be used for divine purposes. The other application of cherem comes in the destruction of things um, that would be detrimental to people. So you have that in play when it comes to things like idols to foreign gods and stuff like that. Anything that had been devoted to the use of another god and that kind of thing. And it was designed to define that boundary between sacred space devoted to one god or the other. So you wanted to make sure that those things weren't allowed to interact because one's going to defile the other. And Yahweh, of course, wants to preserve the integrity of his land and his people. And so certain things were forbidden and had to be destroyed because they had these connections to other gods and um, could potentially defile God's people by leading them astray into the worship of foreign gods, which of course was going to be bad for them. So uh, items like that could be devoted to destruction. Again, that's harem. But then we have a different term, which is haram. And there's just a little difference in vowels there. And of course, I mentioned it's consonantal text. They don't have vowels in there. So again, context is what informs the difference. Okay. So when we're looking at haram, we're now talking about the living. We're talking about people and animals, not just items and objects and things. And it's an important distinction to make because we don't treat them the same way. And although there's some overlap in the meaning and the rationale behind dealing with those things, it's important not to confuse them. Because, I mean, if you take a devoted thing to offer to God, and to devote to his service, you don't want to be using the same terminology to be talking about people that you slaughtered in battle, right? Because our God does not delight in sacrifice, especially not human sacrifice, right? So it's really important that we disambiguate there. But a lot of people, unfortunately, blur those lines because they're looking at the Hebrew root and they're not seeing the distinction which the context illuminates, right? So we've got to consider that carefully. Now, there's some biblical passages that kind of lay this out. You have to get to the Hebrew behind the text to see it, unfortunately, because the translations don't really help us much. But I'll read you quickly a couple of verses from Joshua chapter 6, verses 18 to 19. I've got the King James here. And ye in any wise keep yourselves from the accursed thing, that's harem, lest ye make yourselves accursed, that's haram. When ye take of the accursed thing, that's harem, and make the camp of Israel a curse, again, harem, and trouble it. But all the silver and gold and vessels of brass and iron are consecrated unto the Lord. They shall come in to the treasury of the Lord. So those things are dealt with differently to the people, okay, which the text in Hebrew makes clear, and unfortunately it's lost on us. So you remember the story of Achan, the guy who took some of the plunder from the conquest of Jericho, right? He took some of the devoted things and he was killed for that transgression. This passage explains how that works, right? Because when you take stuff that's meant to be for divine purpose, and you're a common man, you're not supposed to have those things. You've defiled sacred space, right? And God does not allow that to happen, particularly because it has a detrimental effect on the person. Okay, so that's the whole rationale that goes right back to Genesis 6 and the Nephilim, right? You shouldn't cross these earthly and divine boundaries. And that's what we saw in Genesis 6. That's what we see again in the rest of the Torah concerning the giant clans and that sort of thing. So that's the rationale behind the driving out of the Anakim, the giant clans. Unfortunately, most of them resisted being driven out and, in fact, turned around and fought against Israel, which is why they ended up falling in battle. Okay, so the original command was not go and slaughter them all. It was drive them out. And that eventually turned around to, well, if they're not going to leave, then they've chosen their fate. But they're considered to be an abomination, a mingling of divine and human that was done independently of God and against his will. And this is why they were singled out for destruction. All right, so yeah, that's a big no-no because the Bible's very clear about not blurring those lines. Now, a lot of people are really confused about the idea of all that killing and stuff. How can you justify it? And it's important we get back to the idea of people being created in God's image, right? And well, specifically created to be or to bear God's image, right? So the purpose of people in God's original plan is that they embody him and they carry out his work on the earth. And that's really important because uh, that assumption undergirds everything that we read in the conquest narrative. So people who have chosen allegiance to other gods and are allowing them to empower those people, and who are acting as the bodies of these lesser gods. Okay, and I'm talking not only the rebellious sons of God, but their sons, the Nephilim, and those spirits which are empowering these people through these rituals that we talked about earlier. Right? They have transgressed those boundaries. They have chosen not to represent God, but to represent His enemies. Right? This is what's going on here, and they've done it in a fashion that's irreversible. Right? Because it's a flesh and blood um, connection that they've made through these rituals, and you can't pull yeast out of your bread, right? You've made the bread, you've baked it in, you can't separate those things out, and that's why they've got to go, because they've basically effected a permanent corruption of God's image. He's not going to stand for that. So yeah, that's a big factor there, right? And I mentioned yeast in bread because you see that imagery again and again in Scripture, right? Remove all the leaven from your house, sweep the house clean. Don't let any yeast be found uh, in your house. And you have the yeast of the scribes and Pharisees. This idea that false teaching, which in the Second Temple period was associated with the fallen sons of God and the giants. False teaching and misrepresenting uh, the person of God was the primary sin that these divine and semi-divine beings were responsible for. Right, so all these ideas come together in this idea that yeast kind of represents that intrinsic defilement of what God had made good, because you can't take it out again. Right, so it's got to be destroyed. You can't have it. So that's what's going on in the conquest narrative. It is not a wholesale slaughter of every man, woman, and child, as we might be tempted to see it as on face value. But instead, we actually had God first extending some mercy, in the sense that those people could be driven out. And really, I don't think God particularly cared where they went, as long as they were not in His land. Right? Because He'd chosen the promised land as the place where His name would dwell. So these semi-divine entities, these representatives of other gods, they can go somewhere else. But they wouldn't leave God's land, and they posed a very real threat and a danger. And that's the other thing. We're talking military forces here, right? These giant clans had substantial fortifications and military encampments, and they were oppressing the indigenous populations. And it's something that we tend to gloss over. But I mean, you look at Rahab the prostitute in Jericho, right? She was quite happy to assist the Israelite spies to come in and to destroy and conquer Jericho, because she's subject to them, subjugated under them, just like the rest of the population, right? And she wants to be liberated. And that's the experience of the common person in the land, right? So they want to see these giant clans out as well, right? Because they're being oppressed and they're being subjugated. So yeah, it was really important that these people be driven out for the sake of the indigenous communities as well as the Israelites. And it's really important that we talk about that. There's no ethnic distinction, right? When we talk about the Haram, because in that example that I gave you from Joshua 6, that's talking about Israelites, right? We're not talking about foreign people being slaughtered. That was Israelite people. You will corrupt and defile yourself if you touch these accursed things, so don't do it. It's not about ethnic cleansing. It's not about picking on other people groups and employing violence against them. it was never the purpose of what was going on there.